Have you ever been celebrated and erased in the same breath? That was the question echoing in my mind as I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window of my office, the city lights of Manhattan flickering like distant stars. The boardroom behind, me still buzzed with the energy of a promotion I had worked half my life for. Yet beneath my tailored blazer and calm expression, a different kind of tension simmered, one that had nothing to do with corporate strategy and everything to do with blood. From the outside, it looked like a perfect ending. I had just been named Director of Strategic Innovation at one of the top fintech firms in the country. My face had been on the cover of a trade magazine. My team adored me. My numbers were untouchable. But success, I've learned, doesn't silence old ghosts, especially the kind that wear your last name. In 2 days, I was hosting a small celebration, something private, something meaningful. I had imagined a room filled with genuine connection, warm laughter, and a toast to the years it took to climb this far. But what I walked into was not a celebration. It was a stage, and it wasn't built. For me, I was born into a world where everything looked beautiful on the outside. The Laurent estate, perched high above the Malibu cliffs, had been featured in architecture magazines and lifestyle spreads. Floor-to-ceiling glass, minimalist elegance, and an infinity pool that blurred into the Pacific. Our family name was etched onto charity gala plaques and donor walls at private schools. When I was 10, a glossy coffee table book on luxury interiors featured our living room on the cover. People assumed that behind the clean lines and curated lives, there was warmth. They assumed wrong. My parents, Alistair and Vivienne Laurent, were royalty in the West Coast real estate world. My father, a former architect turned mogul, was as brilliant as he was emotionally elusive. My mother, a refined woman with a social calendar more demanding than any career, mastered the art of gracious indifference. I was their firstborn, and in the beginning, I believed that meant something. My early memories are of Montessori tutors, violin lessons and quiet dinners where my father spoke about design philosophies and my mother corrected my posture between courses. But even then, I sensed that love in our household was transactional. It wasn't freely given. It had to be earned, through achievement, appearance, and above all, timing. And when my younger sister Brielle was born, she arrived with perfect timing. Brielle was, to put it plainly, magnetic. Where I was studious and quiet, she was spontaneous and effortlessly charming. She had my mother's bone structure and my father's charm. By the time she was 5, she could win a room with a glance. I once spent weeks preparing a presentation on coral reef conservation for our school's science fair. Brielle showed up with a papier-mâché dolphin and a sparkly headband, and somehow the judges only remembered her. It wasn't that I resented her, not yet. I was still too busy trying to fit into the invisible mold my parents had constructed. I believed that if I worked harder, read more, did everything precisely right, I would be enough. But somewhere between my second fencing medal and the day Brielle was offered a modeling contract at 14, I realized that enough was a moving target. The shift wasn't loud. It crept in quietly. One moment, I was the daughter being introduced proudly at fundraising dinners. The next, I was asked to stay upstairs while Brielle posed with our parents for the press. When I was accepted into Stanford's early decision program, my mother barely paused her phone call to acknowledge it. That same week, Brielle launched a capsule fashion collection. My father had a private chef flown in for her dinner party. Our family celebrated success, just not mine. I remember once overhearing my father on the phone with a colleague. He was talking about us, his daughters. He laughed and said, "Sienna's? The brain, Brielle's the brand. Guess which one's more profitable?" I stood there, just outside his office door, frozen by how casually he had ranked our value. It wasn't cruelty, it was calculation. And it was always clear which side of the equation I fell on, Still, I kept going. I attended Stanford, graduated top of my class in economics, interned every summer at venture firms where my last name opened doors, but my work ethic kept me inside. I was determined to build something of my own. Something that couldn't be dismissed or overshadowed. Meanwhile, Brielle's brand rose and fell with the speed of her social media posts. She dropped out of 2 colleges, launched 3 clothing lines, and trended on Twitter for dating a DJ who crashed a borrowed Lamborghini. None of it seemed to matter. Our parents bailed her out every time, financially, emotionally, and reputationally. But the thing about growing up in a house of curated illusions is that you learn how to keep your own. You learn to stay polished, pleasant, controlled. You don't show anger. You learn to endure it in silence, to swallow disappointment like medicine. Until one day, the silence becomes heavier than the truth. And that day, for me, was coming. Brielle and I were born 5 years apart, but it felt like 2 different lives. By the time she arrived, my parents had already decided what kind of daughter they wanted. She fit the brief perfectly. From the moment she could talk, she charmed everyone. From the doormen of our building in Bel Air to the foreign investors, my father entertained in our home. People called her gifted, magnetic, special. I noticed they never used words like hardworking or focused. That was my domain, the invisible effort, the silent discipline. And somewhere along the way, it became understood that while I might carry the weight, Brielle would carry the spotlight. When I was 16, I was invited to present a data analysis project at a youth economics conference hosted at UCLA. I had built a predictive model for local housing trends using public data and Google Sheets. It was clunky but functional. My mentor at the time told me I had real promise. I remember rushing home, excited to share the news, but my mother was too busy helping Brielle choose a dress for a promotional shoot with a lifestyle blog. My father looked up from his iPad just long enough to say, "That's great, but maybe next time think about making it more visually compelling." People like pretty things. It was like that in every chapter of our lives. Brielle's mediocre poetry was published in a niche online zine and was praised at family dinner for its soul. I wrote a thesis that was shortlisted for an academic award, and my mother told me not to let it go to my head. When Brielle missed her SAT date because she forgot to set an alarm, she was comforted with croissants and a "you'll do, better next time" speech. When I got a 1390, I was asked why I hadn't broken 1400. It wasn't just the unequal attention. It was the narrative, quietly but consistently reinforced, that Brielle was sensitive and needed protecting, while I was strong and could handle being overlooked. When family friends complimented Brielle, they were met with warm smiles and gratitude. When someone praised me, my mother would change the subject or downplay it. One time, when a friend of hers called me brilliant, she laughed and said, "Yes, Sienna's very intense. We're trying to teach her balance." I started to wonder if I was being dramatic, if maybe I was imagining things. After all, it wasn't like they were cruel. I was never denied food, or clothes, or tuition. But emotional presence, fairness, basic acknowledgement, those were currencies they reserved for Brielle, like limited resources they had to spend wisely. The time Brielle was 18, she had a verified Instagram account and a personal brand coach. My parents funded her first clothing line, a capsule of silk sleepwear with vague French slogans. It flopped, naturally, but no one acknowledged the financial loss. They simply reframed it as a learning investment. I remember asking, half-jokingly, if I could have a fraction of that budget to attend a summer data science program in Zurich. My father looked at me and said, "That program won't give you the kind of exposure your sister's getting. Think bigger." That night, I sat in my room, scrolling through Brielle's Instagram feed. Thousands of likes, comments from influencers, glamorous lighting, and rented yachts. And yet, I wasn't envious of her popularity. What I envied was how easily people gave her the benefit of the doubt, how she didn't have to prove her worth to be celebrated. I had been trying to earn that same recognition for years, and all it got me was a polite nod or an unspoken, "not quite." It became clear to me then, in our family, love was performance-based, and I had been playing the wrong role. Still, I didn't confront anyone. That wasn't how things were done in the Laurent household. You smiled, you succeeded, you swallowed, you endured. But even endurance has a limit, and mine was quietly approaching. I don't remember the first time I started blaming myself, but I do remember how natural it felt. Like breathing. That's the thing about subtle neglect. It's not always loud or obvious. It's not about screaming matches or slammed doors. It's the stillness, the silence, the unspoken comparisons that leave the deepest bruises. You start to think maybe you're the problem. Maybe you're just too serious, too focused, too much. Maybe if you smiled more, laughed at the right times, didn't correct people when they misquoted statistics, maybe then they'd see you. For a while, I believed that if I worked harder, it would fix everything. That my achievements would eventually become undeniable. That if I just proved myself, they would have to see me. So I said yes to everything. Honor societies, debate team, coding competitions, summer research labs. I filled every hour, every space, every silence with work. But no matter how much I achieved, it never felt like enough. Not to them, and eventually, not to me. I remember one evening, during my sophomore year at Stanford, I came home for the holidays and found Brielle crying in the kitchen. She'd just gotten into an argument with a photographer who criticized her latest shoot. She was inconsolable. My mother sat beside her, stroking her hair like she was 5 years old again, whispering that no one appreciated her genius. My father stood behind them, rubbing her shoulders, saying things like, "People who don't create will never understand those who do." I stood in the doorway, holding a research paper I had just gotten published in a peer-reviewed journal, a rare honor for an undergrad. No one asked about it. No one even noticed the printout in my hand. That night, I stared at my reflection in the mirror for a long time, studying the angles of my face, the slight downturn of my lips when I wasn't smiling, the sharpness in my eyes. I wondered if something in me repelled warmth. Maybe I lacked softness. Maybe that's why I was easier to ignore. In our family, empathy wasn't a given. It had to be earned, and Brielle had perfected the performance of fragility. She broke down often, needed rescuing constantly, and everyone rallied behind her, like she was made of glass. I, on the other hand, was the one who handled things. When I didn't cry over criticism, they called it maturity. When I didn't ask for help, they called it independence. But I wasn't strong. I was just exhausted. And I was afraid that if I let the exhaustion show, I'd lose the one thing. I'd earned their respect, even if it was reluctant. There was a moment that winter break when my mother said something that lodged itself in my chest like a splinter. We were decorating the house for a New Year's party, and she was fussing over the lighting for Brielle's corner display, some shelves showing her creative journey through old sketchbooks and mood boards. I offered to help with the guest list, noting that several of my mentors from Stanford had expressed interest in coming. My mother didn't even look up from the centerpiece she was arranging. "Sienna, you don't need to be involved in everything. Let your sister have her space. It's important she feels seen." It was the way she said it. Calm, final. Like my presence was disruptive. Not aggressive, just unnecessary. That was the first time I fully understood what I had been fighting all these years. Not just favoritism, but invisibility. I wasn't being pushed out. I had never been let in. I had mistaken tolerance for love, politeness for pride, and yet somehow I still thought it was my fault. Still believed that maybe if I had been more like Brielle, softer, sweeter, less precise, things would be different. That belief stayed with me, quietly poisoning every win. Even when I landed a competitive internship at a boutique investment firm in San Francisco the following summer, I remember thinking, don't get your hopes up. They'll find a way to ignore this, too. I wish I could say I stopped caring then. That I woke up one morning and realized my worth didn't depend on their validation. But the truth is, I carried that hunger for acknowledgement into every room. I entered every pitch I gave, every late-night project I stayed up refining. I didn't just want to succeed. I wanted to be undeniable. Because part of me still hoped that if I just climbed high enough, they'd finally look up. There's something unsettling about watching someone else settle into your space like it was always meant for them. That's how I felt the day Brielle moved into my room. The room I had grown up in. The one with the white balcony doors that opened out to the cliffside view of the Pacific. That room had been mine since I was 6. It was the only place in that house that ever truly felt like mine. Not because of the view or the custom furniture or the thick, cloud-like rug, but because it was where I had built my own sense of safety. Late-night reading marathons under dim lamplight, early morning scribbles in my journals, notes taped to the mirror before every exam. That space held the version of me no one in my family ever really bothered to see. It happened just before my senior year at Stanford, during summer break. I came home to rest, to catch my breath after finishing a research fellowship and a consulting project back-to-back. I arrived late in the evening, expecting my usual quiet check-in with the housekeeper, and maybe a nod from my parents if they were still awake. Instead, I walked through the front doors to find my father standing in the hallway, smiling like he was doing me a favor. "Sienna, we've made a few changes. Your room's been reassigned. Brielle needs the space for her design studio." At first, I thought he was joking. I blinked, waiting for the punchline. None came. I walked upstairs instinctively, half in denial, and opened the door to what used to be my room. Gone were my bookshelves, my desk, my collection of postcards from academic conferences around the world. In their place stood white-paneled display cases, racks of clothing samples, and vision boards cluttered with magazine cutouts and handwritten quotes like "Muse over metrics" and "Dare to dream." On the new vanity sat jars of brushes, swatches of fabric, and a lavender-scented candle with a gold foil label that read, "Brielle Home." I stood at the threshold, unmoving. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because the words I wanted to say had already been swallowed too, many times before. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I turned and walked to the far end of the hall where the guest room sat, cold and impersonal. The room I was now assigned to was smaller, dimmer, facing the back of the property where the light didn't quite reach until late afternoon. The closet door stuck when you opened it, and the ceiling fan buzzed faintly like it was apologizing. No. One asked if I was okay. No one offered to help me move my things. In fact, most of them had already been moved for me. Labeled boxes lined the wall. On one of them was a note in my mother's handwriting. "Try to keep things minimal, Brielle. Needs the closet space." I sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed, surrounded by the quiet hum of a house that had made its choice. It wasn't just about a room. It never was. It was about a pattern, a message, reinforced over years, now made physical. You don't matter. Enough to keep the one place you called your own. That night, I opened the window of my new room, searching for the sound of the ocean I had once fallen asleep to. I couldn't hear it anymore. It was still there, of course, endless, vast, unconcerned, but it no longer felt close. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was returning home. I felt like I was being quietly erased, and something inside me shifted. Not in anger, in clarity. Because no matter how carefully I'd tried to play their game, I realized now I was never meant to win it, and I was done pretending I had a place in a house that had already closed the door on me. The night I sat in that guest room, staring at a ceiling I didn't recognize, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would never beg for space again. Not in a room, not in a conversation, not in a life. That promise carried me through my final year at Stanford, where I poured everything I had into the things I could control: my work, my mind, my vision for the future. I stopped calling home except when necessary. I didn't tell them when I was selected as lead coordinator for a national tech policy initiative. I didn't mention that my predictive modeling paper was published in a top journal. It no longer mattered if they noticed. What mattered was that I did. After graduation, I moved to New York with nothing but a suitcase, a binder of research proposals, and an offer letter from Halberton Equity, a boutique investment firm known for its focus on emerging tech. It wasn't glamorous. I lived in a shared apartment in the East Village, with peeling walls and a radiator that hissed like it was judging me. I made instant noodles, rode the subway with strangers who never made eye contact, and stayed late in the office even when no one asked me to. But I was free, and I was building something of my own. Within a year, I pitched a strategy that saved the firm over $2 million in a botched crypto acquisition. That presentation, 32 slides of surgical precision, was the first time I saw partners at the firm look at me like I wasn't just another ambitious hire, but a force. They gave me room after that. Not favors, not shortcuts, just room. And that was all I had ever wanted. By 25, I'd earned a reputation as someone who could spot the weak link in a proposal faster than most analysts could run a model. I started getting invited to internal planning meetings, then to strategy sessions. And when the market began shifting toward decentralized finance, I was already ahead of the curve. While others were still watching volatility, I was studying behavioral data. What people feared, what moved them, what they were silently betting on. That's when I started building Argus. Argus wasn't just an algorithm. It was a behavioral forecast engine that analyzed real-time market sentiment using social media pulses, economic triggers, and geopolitical data. It could anticipate trends before they showed up in traditional indicators. I built it quietly, on weekends and late nights, testing theories, refining code, staying 3 steps ahead of where the market thought it was going. When I finally presented it to the managing director, I didn't expect much. But 2 weeks later, it was integrated into Halberton's analytics suite. And 6 months after that, it correctly predicted a 19% shift in a sector everyone else had written off. The recognition came fast. Press mentions, client meetings, even a quote in Forbes. But what mattered more than any headline was the feeling of having done something on my own terms. It was around that time I was promoted to Director of Strategic Innovation. I remember sitting alone in the quiet of my office the night the announcement went out, the lights of Midtown glittering below. I didn't cry. I didn't call my parents. I simply stared out at the skyline and whispered, "This is mine. Not given. Not gifted." Earned, I started getting emails from younger women in finance asking for advice. I mentored when I could. I said yes to keynote panels and joined a think tank on ethical fintech. I launched a private newsletter decoding financial systems for first-generation professionals and donated to education equity programs. I wasn't just building a career. I was building a voice for myself and for others who had been overlooked, underestimated, or quietly replaced. And yet, despite it all, when I decided to host a small celebration for my promotion, a part of me still wanted my family to be part of it. Not for validation, not anymore, but maybe as a gesture, a test, a chance for something better. So when my mother offered to help plan it, suggesting we host it at the family estate for old time's sake, I said yes. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that we had all grown up. But I had forgotten the one rule in the Laurent household that never changed. Everything has its place, and I was never meant to be the centerpiece. The planning started innocently enough. I sent my mother the event brief, a guest list of about 30, mostly colleagues, mentors, and a few close friends from my Stanford days. I booked the rooftop of a boutique hotel in Soho, sleek and understated, with skyline views and warm lighting. The vibe I wanted was clear, intimate, earned, intentional. She called me 2 days later, her voice smooth as ever, suggesting a change of venue. "Wouldn't it be more meaningful to have it at home?" she said. "Something elegant, but personal. Besides, your father would love to host something in your honor. It's been too long." I hesitated. The idea of going back to the estate, the same house that once displaced me, made my stomach tighten. But I told myself this wasn't about the past. I had changed. Maybe they had too. So I agreed, on one condition. I would transfer the budget and let her handle logistics, but she had to follow the brief. "Of course, darling," she said. "Just send the funds and leave the rest to me." I wired $8,000 into her account and tried to let go. Work kept me occupied. My inbox was flooded with partnership inquiries and speaking requests. Argus had just been licensed to a global analytics firm, and I was leading a team, of 15 now. I didn't have time to micromanage tablecloth colors or menu selections. I trusted her. Or more accurately, I gave her one last chance to prove she could see me. The day of the event arrived bright and crisp, early spring sunlight filtering through the glass walls of LAX as I boarded a flight back to Los Angeles. I wore a navy dress, structured but soft, and carried with me a short speech, handwritten on thick cardstock. Nothing flashy, just a few words to thank the people who believed in me when I was building in silence. I arrived at the Laurent estate that afternoon, suitcase in one hand, a bottle of vintage wine in the other. But from the moment I stepped inside, I knew something was off. The entrance had been transformed. Golden calligraphy banners hung from the archways. White orchids lined the foyer. Servers moved between clusters of guests with trays of sparkling rosé and hors d'oeuvres I hadn't approved. A table near the back was covered in black velvet and featured what looked like product displays: candles, perfume, mood boards, and folded cards that read the Brielle collection. I blinked. My chest tightened. Then I saw her, Brielle, descending the staircase in a flowing ivory jumpsuit, hair perfectly styled, a microphone in hand. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice sweet and polished. "This evening means the world to me. It's not just a celebration of my newest venture, but of the people who made it possible." Applause erupted. My mother beamed from across the room, clasping her hands like she had just watched a Broadway debut. My father stood beside her, silent, sipping champagne. I walked over to the gift table and saw the event cards. Brielle Laurent presents a lifestyle launch for the Modern Muse. Modern Muse, not strategic director, not financial innovator. Muse. Felt a slow burn rise in my throat. Not rage, just the kind of quiet fury that only comes after years of being told to wait your turn, make room, play nice. I glanced around the room and saw my mentors, my team members, even the COO of Halberton, standing politely, clapping for something they didn't understand. They thought this was my event. They had come for me. But the stage had been handed, off without my consent. I found my mother near the grand piano. "You said this was my celebration," I said, voice calm but clipped. She barely looked at me. "Brielle needed the exposure. You've already made it, darling. Let her have this." And just like that, the lie was complete. They hadn't changed. They never saw me, not really. I was useful, not meaningful. A provider, not a person. I stepped away from her, picked up my champagne glass, and walked to the center of the room. The microphone was still in Brielle's hand, but she paused when she saw me approach. I didn't ask for it. I didn't need to, because for once, I wasn't there to ask. I was there to take back what had always been mine. The room didn't fall silent all at once. At first, there was just a shift in energy, a collective breath being held, eyes subtly turning toward me. Brielle stiffened but didn't move. My parents exchanged a glance, the kind that silently conveyed warning. But I had already crossed the invisible threshold, the one I'd been taught never to approach. the space where truth lives, even when it's inconvenient. I took a slow sip from my glass, stepped beside Brielle, and faced the crowd. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The weight of clarity carries farther than volume ever could. Thank you all for coming tonight, I said evenly. But I think there's been a misunderstanding. A few awkward chuckles, some half smiles. People assumed I was making a joke, but I continued. This event was meant to celebrate a professional milestone, my promotion to Director of Strategic Innovation at Halberton Equity. A role I earned through years of work, risk, and resilience. I sent the invitations. I paid for the venue, the catering, and the decor. What I didn't authorize, what I wasn't even told, was that my celebration would be repurposed into a launch party for someone else, gasps now. Soft, genuine, followed by silence thick enough to cut. My mother started moving toward me, face pale, lips forming my name in a warning tone. I lifted a hand, gently, firmly, and she froze. I don't say this to shame anyone, I continued. But I've spent most of my life in rooms like this one. Rooms where I was present, but not seen. Where my achievements were used as backdrops for other people's narratives. I let it happen for a long time. Out of politeness, out of loyalty, out of hope. But tonight, I choose something different. I turned to Brielle, whose smile had melted into confusion. Her confidence cracked at the edges. Her boyfriend Nathan, a tech investor I'd met once at a panel, looked from her to me, clearly blindsided. You told me this was a family event, he whispered to Brielle, loud enough for the front row to hear. She faltered. It is. I didn't think. You didn't think I'd find out? That's what you didn't think, I cut in, but not with venom, just finality. You used my name, my money, and my people to build something that had nothing to do with me, just like you always have. Nathan took a step back. You knew this wasn't your night, and you still let me invest? He didn't wait for an answer. He left his champagne on the table and walked out the front door. Brielle stared after him, frozen in place. My father stood then, stern-faced. Sienna, that's enough. You're making a scene. I turned to him slowly. No, I'm telling the truth. It only feels like a scene because you're not used to hearing it out loud. The crowd stayed frozen. Some averted their eyes. Others nodded, subtly. The kind of nod you give when someone finally says what you've always known but never dared to acknowledge. Then, from the side of the room, a familiar voice spoke. Well, I always did say the quiet ones would rise. It was my grandfather, my mother's father, seated near the back. He stood now, slowly but firmly, and joined me in the center. I suppose now's as good a time as any, he said, addressing the crowd. Vivian, he said, turning to my mother, we updated the family trust 2 months ago. The majority of our estate, including the charitable foundation, will go to Sienna. My mother's mouth fell open. What? You've spent years convincing us that she didn't need our support, he said quietly. Turns out you were right. She didn't. And that's exactly why she's the one we trust to carry this family forward. Brielle let out a sharp breath, half gasp, half disbelief. My mother stepped back as though the floor had shifted beneath her. I didn't gloat. I didn't cry. I simply placed my glass down on the nearest table and nodded toward my team, who had gathered near the entrance. Thank you all for coming, I said again, this time with calm command. Enjoy the evening. There's still a skyline worth celebrating. And with that, I stepped off their stage and onto my own. For a long moment after I stepped away, the room remained frozen, like a paused film. No music, no chatter, no polite clinking of glasses. Just silence, raw, unfiltered silence, filling every inch of that carefully curated evening. My mother stood as if rooted in place, her hand resting on the back of a velvet chair, her jaw tight with disbelief. Brielle looked like someone had yanked the spotlight off her mid-sentence. Her face, still camera-ready, showed the first traces of something unfamiliar. Exposure. I walked to the back of the room where my grandfather was waiting. He nodded at me, then turned to the guests with a composure that made people lean in. Sienna didn't just earn her position in business, he said calmly. She earned our trust as a family. And as many of you know, trust, especially in legacy, is everything. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence carried weight, the kind of weight that silences rebuttals before they're even spoken. In recent years, he continued, we've observed patterns that troubled us. Manipulation disguised as creativity, entitlement packaged as vulnerability, and a persistent erasure of someone who should have been front and center from the beginning. That ends now. He pulled a folded letter from his coat pocket. This document is a formal amendment to the Laurent Trust. Effective immediately, the majority stake in our holdings, including our philanthropic endowments and voting rights on the board, will go to Sienna. We believe legacy should be built on integrity, not performance. Gasps echoed like ricochets. My father took a step forward but said nothing. For once, he looked less like a patriarch and more like a man realizing his influence had expired. Brielle finally found her voice. You can't do this, she said, the tremble in her throat poorly masked by defiance. I'm your granddaughter, too. My grandfather looked at her with a gaze that wasn't cruel, but it was clear. And we love you, Brielle. But love and leadership are not the same. Sienna didn't ask for any of this. She never needed to. That's why it's hers. My mother turned to me then, eyes wide, not with sorrow but with calculation. You think this makes you powerful? She said, her voice cutting. You've just divided the family. I held her gaze and answered simply, no, I just stopped, pretending it wasn't already broken. I didn't linger for applause. I didn't want it. I thanked my guests again, made sure my team was taken care of, and quietly slipped away through the side garden. The air outside was still, cool, and honest. For the first time in my life, I wasn't walking away in silence. I was walking away with something far more valuable: clarity. Because I hadn't taken anything from them. They had simply never expected me to take it back. 3 years have passed since the night I walked out of that estate and left behind everything that once held me small. I haven't spoken to my parents since, not out of bitterness, but choice. There was no dramatic final phone call, no apology waiting in my inbox. Just silence. The kind that, for the first time, felt freeing. I now live in Tribeca, in a light-filled apartment that overlooks the Hudson. It's not the largest place I've lived, but it's the first that feels entirely mine. My mornings begin early, coffee in hand, scrolling through the latest metrics from Argus Horizon, the evolved platform my team and I launched last year. We've grown from a whisper in the industry to a trusted voice in financial strategy, especially among firms looking to bridge ethics and innovation. On weekends, I teach a mentorship workshop for first-gen college students pursuing careers in Taoidai finance. It's the highlight of my week. I see in their eyes the same hunger I once had, not just to succeed, but to be seen while doing it. And I tell them, gently but honestly, that the road isn't always paved with recognition. Sometimes it's paved with silence. And that's okay, because silence teaches you to build your own echo. Brielle? She tried launching another lifestyle brand, but it never found footing. The market had shifted. So had people's patience for polished illusions. I hear she lives in a smaller condo now, one of our family's leftover properties. She's quiet on social media these days. As for me, I no longer measure my life by who claps for it. I measure it by who I've become in the quiet after the noise. And in that quiet, I've never stood taller. Sienna's story isn't just about ambition or betrayal. It's about the deep, often unspoken cost of being overlooked in your own family. Emotional favoritism is rarely loud. It hides behind polite smiles, unequal praise, and the quiet redistribution of attention. And yet, it can shape someone's entire identity. When a child grows up believing they must earn love by outperforming expectations, they often chase validation into adulthood. Until one day, they realize they're running toward people who were never truly watching. What's powerful about Sienna's journey is not just the rise to success, but the emotional clarity she gained by stepping away. She didn't seek revenge. She chose truth. She didn't burn bridges. She simply stopped crossing the ones that only led her back into silence. That is what makes this story resonate, not just for those from wealthy households, but for anyone who has ever felt unseen in a space they were told to call home. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of a moment when you realized your worth didn't depend on someone else's recognition, you're not alone. We'd love to hear from you. Share your story in the comments. Who did you have to become to finally be seen? And if this message matters to you, pass it on. Someone out there is still waiting to hear it.